Okay, here we go with our first video lecture of the year. So let me just say welcome to the AP Environmental Science class. Looking forward to a great year with you folks. I think this is a fantastic class, and I'm glad you're along for the ride, and I hope it's an enjoyable one for you and also informative, of course. Okay, so chapter 1 is the environment and sustainability. So that's the title of the chapter. And in one word, sustainability is a great way of encapsulating what this course is about. So if we're going to talk about sustainability, we should talk about what sustainability means. And sustainability is the idea that the natural systems that the earth provides us with, that we're reliant on, will be able to survive, flourish, and continue indefinitely for generations to come. So that's the idea of sustainability. So we'll talk a lot about that. So the center theme of this whole course is sustainability. So it's very important for this course and important for the world as well at this point, right? Okay, so let's talk about something called the commons. You can see that we're talking about the tragedy of the commons here. And the Tragedy of the Commons was a paper that was written in 1968 by Garrett Hardin. And this was in Science Digest. So the idea that Garrett Hardin presented was involving out west overgrazing of the lands. So there was an area of commons that were open to everybody to graze if they had cattle, and anybody could do it. And so this was commons. Commons are something that are renewable resources that are open to everybody. Open access renewable resources. And the pasture lands that the cows were grazing on and the livestock was grazing on were common ground. And what happened was, the tragedy of the commons that he noticed. Everybody knew that you couldn't overgraze it, but everybody thought, I'll take a little piece of it. I'll take a little piece of it. I'll take a little piece of it for myself. That won't do any harm. Where other people are taking from it, I need to also take from it. And it escalated to the point where the lands were overgrazed. But this could certainly be extrapolated to think about the air, the clean air that we have. That's a commons. Clean water is a commons that we have. And so just what happened with the overgrazing is happening with all these things. The forest lands that we have, the fisheries that we have. So that's the idea of the tragedy of the commons. And this 1968 here really starts off the age of the environmental movements, where people are starting to think about what's going on and how it is going to affect the future and how it's going to affect sustainability. Up until this point, perhaps, a lot of what we were doing, because we were advancing so rapidly at that time, but I'm fairly sure, I'm 100% sure, that people were very happy about the technological developments that they were seeing in their times, amazing times. But at this point, and with Garrett Hardin and these other environmentalists at the time, we started talking about these unintended consequences. So we have to kind of know about, what we're doing and what the ramifications of it could be. So there's a good start to the class here. All right, so environmental science is going to study connections in nature. Now, we're going to talk about, the Earth itself and how the Earth works and how it works without humans. And then in environmental science, we're also going to talk about humans and how they're interacting with their environment. And we're going to talk about the idea of living more sustainably. And into this comes so much, and it's really it takes in everything that's going on in our world right now. I've said this many times, I believe I could teach this course just by following the headlines, because it's just so important, all of these interconnecting pieces in our lives right now. So sure, it's going to be biology, and it's going to be chemistry, and it's going to be physics, and it's going to be economics, and it's going to be politics, and it's going to be all kinds of different things. Philosophy. There's going to be all kinds of things involved in here in environmental science. So it's really not just about the natural world, it's about how we deal with the natural world. Now, ecology is going to be a piece of biology. Some of it you'll cover in biology, the living world, of course. So, ecology is talking about all these living things that are out there, human beings included, but every part of the living world that we have. So, that's the biology tie in. But it also talks about how they react with the non living parts of their environment, and that's ecology. So it's really starting to talk about how these things really work. An ecosystem is a setup where you have lots of organisms in a defined area that are interacting with each other, lots of living things. So this will talk about all the living things in a particular area, an ecosystem, and how they react with each other. And their non-living environment as well. So that's an ecosystem. So an ecosystem could be a pond, or an ecosystem could be a patch of forest. Something where there's similar types of plants that are in the environment. Starts with the plants, and then it's the interactions of the living things around there. So that's the idea of an ecosystem. Now, environmentalism is different from this. This environmentalism is this activism. This is where people maybe identified and recognized things that Garrett Hardin was talking about, and also said, we're going to try to make a change. So there was a lot of this going on, like I said, around that time, the early 70s. And I can remember this. Having been born in 1964, I remember watching this stuff progress. All right, so that's the idea of environmentalism. And for that, it's going to be a people movement. They say it takes 5 to 10% of the people in a population to make a change. And that's a social movement that's going on there to try to live more sustainably and recognize the unintended consequences and avoid these kind of consequences that will be detrimental to every living thing, humans included. So this environmentalism is going to involve politics, as you can imagine. You can't really say we're going to do something like stop using coal. All right, well, stop using coal. We've identified that it's bad for the environment. What's the economics of that? You have to think about these things. And so this is going to be a thing that's going to involve politics, always does, and is going to involve ethics too, how people view the world. And there we go. The environmental science is now getting to the point where we're saying, well, let's study this stuff in detail so we have an idea of what we're talking about. We recognize some of these unintended consequences, and maybe we want to do something and maybe do a little bit better in the future. All right, so we could talk about 3 scientific principles of sustainability. That's one way of looking at it for sure, and one of them is going to be the solar energy that we're relying on. Can't do anything without the sun, and this is going to warm us, that's for sure. We need the sun for that, and it also in a big way starts the food chain and the energy chain, because that energy from the sun goes into the producers, the plants, and that goes into every living thing. So any living thing that does any kind of work or gets anything done at all, that energy can be traced back to the sun. And then it goes many, many different places, of course. Even if we talk about the energy involved with fossil fuels, that comes from the sun, as does wind energy. And we'll talk more about all of those things, of course. So there's that's one of the 3 major principles for sustainability. We have to continue to rely on this perpetual resource of solar energy. And another one is biodiversity. So a second one, we could consider it as a second one, biodiversity. And this is the biodiversity encompasses a few different things. The obvious one is the different kind of species. Now, once we start looking into environmental science and seeing how these things really work in ecology, we understand that all of these different species, plant and animal species, have their role in their ecosystems. And so the biodiversity is important. And it's important within an individual species as well that there's biodiversity, that there's genetic biodiversity. So biodiversity is going to be an important one. And when we start taking some of these links of the chain out, we have, at first, unintended consequences, and now we're starting to really understand the consequences, how biodiversity, how important it is. You might be bothered by bugs sometimes. I know I have been, but they bug me, right? We even say that. but they're important in the ecosystem, and birds feed on them, and so on and so forth, and amphibians, and so they have their role as well, even if they bother us from time to time. And that's the idea of the biodiversity. The other thing is what you might call chemical, or is sometimes called nutrient cycling. And the idea here is the plants can't do it with just the sunlight. They need some nutrients. So we'll start with the nutrient cycling that involves plants. So they need things that are going to be cycled through. And this cycle implies a closed loop. So what happens in one part of this cycle affects the next part of the cycle. So the plants need the nutrients to grow, so they have the nutrients. Well, it takes bacteria to put them into a form that they can use. So we need the bacteria in there, and then the plants, and then the animals or other species, insects as well, are going to eat the planets, and then they're going to die. And when they die, those nutrients will go back into the soil, or back into the atmosphere, and then back into the soil. And this is the idea of the chemical cycling. You could talk about some of these cycles that we're talking about. You could talk about the water cycle as another example, of things that are cycled through. The water goes into the ground. The plants take up the water. They use it, that magic, with those nutrients and that sunlight to be able to produce, but they need the water too. And then they breathe that out a little bit, in a sense. The transpiration of the water comes out and it goes back up into the sky, and then we need water. And that's the idea here. So here's a graphic that kind of reminds you of those three basic principles of the solar energy, the chemical cycling, and the biodiversity. All right, so we could also talk about some key components of sustainability, and we'll establish some vocabulary here that we'll use throughout the course. And one of them is going to be natural capital. And these are things that nature provides for us that keep us alive, supports our economies, and keeps us alive. So this is the natural capital. Keeps us breathing, keeps us drinking, keeps us in our houses, keeps us with our energy. So all this stuff that we have here. And one of the things that is involved with the natural capital is natural resources. And these are the things that we use directly. And we could talk about them as being inexhaustible. That would be the sun would be inexhaustible. Renewable, clean air, clean water are renewable resources. And then non-renewable. And that at this point would be our fossil fuels and the metals that we have in the ground that we're using now. They're exhaustible. They're not going to be replaced in a human lifetime or a decade or so. Another thing that we need that comes under the natural capital is the services that the ecosystems supply. So they give us the clean air, and they'll purify the water for us. And these are the services that the ecosystems provide for all living things. Okay, so let's talk about them a little bit more, but let's acknowledge here, and this is going to be a big part of the class, is that things that human beings have done have degraded this natural capital. So again, I've talked about it as being unintended consequences, but that era is over. Now we have to talk about the consequences and what the ramifications are. And also we have to talk about maybe understanding the consequences and going ahead with the activities that we have. But yes, we've had a big role in this, more than any other species ever has. So here's a little idea of your natural resources and your ecosystem services. So like I said, the air being purified, the ozone layer protecting us from the UV radiation, controlling the climate, the biodiversity that keeps the populations of species in control, and the soil renewal, and the land gives us food and cycles the nutrients for us. And the land itself would be the natural resource, the soil, and the water and the air. So there's a nice graphic. By the way, since this is the first graphic that I'm showing you, these are great graphics that your book has. So as you're going through the textbook and keeping up with your reading and the videos and the material that we're going through, try to understand these graphics. They really capture a lot for you there in a good way. Okay, so there we go again with the idea of the inexhaustible, the renewable, and the non-renewable stuff there. So solar energy and like I said again, wind is relying on the sun as well. Things move from hot to cold, and so wind energy is relying on the sun. And then there's geothermal energy, which is in the earth. So that's not relying on the sun. That's heat that's already in the earth. And then we got the idea of the renewable, and there's a picture of a nice stand of trees. I sure do like being out in the trees myself. And there's the non-renewable, and that's the stuff where we're really in going after them. And it's really brilliant that humans were able to figure this stuff out anyway. But boy, in going after these non-renewables, we're sure doing a number on it. But that was amazing that humans figured it out in the first place. All right, so here's a couple of other things that we could talk about if we were talking about the additional principles of sustainability. And I've already mentioned these before. So economics comes into it. Again, their whole livelihoods are built around these things that are degrading the earth. But another thing that they're mentioning in this graphic is the full cost pricing. Now, when we pay for our goods, we pay for the price of them. And we like to have a low price for them, and we shop around to get that low price. But never in that price is the cost to health and the degrading of the natural capital. We all pay for that in big ways and in noticeable ways, but we don't pay for it in the pricing. And, if we paid a little bit more for things and we understood the other costs involved, we might be a little more careful with the way we're living and the decisions that we make. Politics as well. You want to get to the point where everybody can be happy. And these are divisive issues, these economic and environmental decisions that are made. So it's good if you can find politically a way that everybody is going to make out in it. And that's my hope for the future. And I think that's humanity's hope for the future, that we find ways that we can live sustainably that can be palatable to as many people as possible. But boy, it is hard to please everybody. And that becomes a huge part of it, the politics. And related to all this is the ethics. What do we think is our responsibility with all this stuff? What are we supposed to do here? What are our ethics? How responsible are we to future generations? I remember hearing it said that we really care about our kids. I have a kid. I care about my kid, my students as well. And my kid has a kid, the grandkids. But how far past that are we looking when we make these decisions? And that's got a lot to do with your worldview. And another thing that's different as far as the world goes is the reality of life for people in different parts of the world. So we live in what would be called a more developed country, one of the most developed countries, and that's the United States, right? So there's an inequity going on in the world. So I'm making this video in 2022, so some of the information will be changed as the years go by. Hello, whoever you are. I guess I'm speaking to the future. I imagine this video will be watched at least a few years into the future. If it's anything like my old ones, I'm finally updating myself. My last videos were about 5, 6, 7 years old, and so much has changed in that time. Hey, anybody ever hear of that coronavirus? Well, I hadn't when I made the first round of videos, just to give you an idea of how much the world can change. But at this point, we're talking about 17% of the world population lives in what's called more developed countries, more industrialized nations, high income for the people. But here's a disparity as well. Only 17% of the population, but we use up 70% of the world's natural resources. In the less developed parts of the world, places like India and China are considered less developed. But India has a space program, and China has very modern technology. So there's a lot of different gradients here between more developed and less developed. But in general, we can say that in the less developed parts of the world, that's 83% of the world's population. But they're only using 30% of the world's natural resources. So there's the disparity in how our cultural differences create some of our world outlooks. Here's another one of those great things that we're talking about, these graphics. And now I'm going to talk about the ecological footprint. Ecological footprint is going to be how much do we need on average, how much land and how much resources do we need per person to live the way we're living. And that's a concept of an ecological footprint. And in the more developed part of the world, we are exceeding the ecological footprint that one planet can provide. And that's a big deal. All right, so here's the way that we're degrading the natural capital. This is stuff that we'll keep revisiting, but here's a great graphic for you to get you started on that thought process. So we're polluting the air, we're causing climate change, we're eroding the soil, shrinking the forest, degrading the habitats, causing species extinction, and cutting down on the water, the fresh water that we have available to us, degrading it and using it up faster than is going to be sustainably regenerated, and cutting down on the fisheries. We're just making this a mass production, industrialized fishing, and polluting the water as we go. So these are the things that we're doing. And a really big thing of it is to say, a way of summing it up is to say, we are not living sustainably. We are living unsustainably. At the rate we're going, we don't have enough Earths to make it happen for future generations. And we got to turn some things around here if we're going to survive. So here we talk about the idea of the degradation. And I believe when they look back at this time period in humanity, they'll call it an era of amazing waste. We're just using things up. And again, we're not too far back to where we started learning all these things that helped us degrade the environment, but also helped us advance as human beings. But now we know the consequences. And at the beginning, it must have seemed like it would go on forever when we first started tapping into this stuff. But that's not the case. We know differently now. And so it's estimated here in 2022 or thereabouts that humans are directly affecting 83% of the land surface. Now, there have been species extinctions before, but now it is rapidly happening, and it's because of human behaviors. There's absolutely no way you can say it's not, in my opinion anyway. Follow the science at this point. But we're really doing something here that no other species has figured out how to do. So the Earth has gone through some changes, but we're bringing the Earth through some changes now, or at least the living things on the Earth and the atmosphere and all of it through some changes by our actions. So that's a big deal. And of course, when you're talking about biodiversity, you're directly affecting that in a negative way. Okay, so cultural changes can affect these ecological footprints. And I've started talking about some of that right now. So we can talk about that a little bit more. Maybe we'll talk a little bit culturally if we're talking about that. It's human culture, right? We were hunters and gatherers 10,000 years ago, up into about 10,000 years ago. And now we are not. We are no longer hunter and gatherers. So what we're doing now is we've gone through a few revolutions. We're going through a revolution right now. But we started it out and changed the way the humans impacted the earth here in a dramatic way, and how humans lived in the earth by three major events. We could start with agriculture. We were hunter-gatherers. We had to follow the food. We had to live in that cycle. We were reliant on the ecosystems to live because we lived sustainably with them. We had to. There was no other choice. We were part of it. But when we figured out agriculture, we didn't have to chase our food source anymore. We domesticated livestock and we got into planting crops. So that was a huge deal that allowed us to settle and start forming towns and cities and villages. But eventually cities is the main thing that we went through. And then we went through the Industrial Medical Revolution. We discovered things about the earth as we were sitting still and looking around a little bit more than chasing it around. And we found out that there was energy that we had no idea about up until that point. And that's the fossil fuel era beginning. And it starts with coal. And we unleash this energy, and we start developing technologies, machines, and we start using these machines to make our lives different, but also to go after more of those resources, and just make the whole world change it dramatically at that point. And this is not too long ago. It's my entire lifespan, the fossil fuel era, let's say, and it will probably be your entire lifespan. But not much longer than that, and not much, what didn't start much before I was born either. And during this time, we also, figured some things out medically, that we needed increased sanitation, and we found out about germs and how you could prevent some of these things. I mean, that let people live longer lives too, which changed the population of the earth. And then, and we're in it now, we're going through this information revolution, computerization. We can get live feeds from any part of the world, and we realize now that we're all connected in ways that we never knew before. Certainly not 10,000 years ago, maybe not 200 years ago, 150 years ago, 100 years ago. It's amazing what we know now and how fast the information gets around. And so this is globalization, where we see how the earth is all connected. It always was, but our impact is bigger, and we're seeing it more and more now. And people would tell you now that we are in a sustainability revolution. Let's talk about this idea of environmental impact. Our environmental impact as a species depends on a few things: population, affluence. Affluence is where we have a culture that's got a lot of great stuff, like a developed country, but we use a lot of materials for that affluence, and the technology. Technology can be good. It can help us solve some of these problems that we've created, but it also creates a lot of problems in the first place. So a big population will have an impact. In the lesser developed part of the world, their large population is offset by the idea that they don't have a level of affluence like we do now. But they're starting to get more affluent, and they want to, and that's natural. We did it too, and they want to come into that, and that currently will mean using more resources. So that is what we're up against here. This is what we have to deal with. All right, so what are these environmental problems? We've already talked about them. Let's sum them up a little bit. It's the growth of the population, the human population. That creates problems, right? And it's that we're using our resources unsustainably. And poverty. When people are living in poverty, like lots and lots of people, we don't maybe understand that in the United States as much as some other countries do, although we have poverty here too. And if you're living in poverty, you're not thinking of these esoteric plans for the future and what we can do. You're trying to live through the day and get through the week, let's say. And so you're living in poverty, you're not going to be thinking about the long-term stuff. And as I mentioned before, we don't put the full price of all this stuff in our goods and services. We create through going after these resources, through disposing of them, through generating our energy. To create all these things in the first place, we create health problems. We create problems to the earth that are going to cost us all. But we don't put those prices in the goods and services. We're less understanding of what nature is. Where does food come from? It comes from the supermarket, of course. I go to the supermarket and I buy my stuff packaged up in single-use containers that'll be just thrown out, and they're filled. Every aisle is filled with them, and there's lots of aisles in my grocery store. And my grocery store isn't even the only one in my town. And then my town isn't the only town around. But we don't really get our food from the grocery store exactly. It's got to come from someplace else first, but we don't realize it as much. We're not out there hunting and gathering and understanding nature. We're driving on highways. We remove nature from the picture. And so we don't value it, maybe, in some cases, as much. We don't understand it as much. Okay. And again, there are different views in the world of how people look at the world and what they should be doing environmentally. So that's why we got these problems. And again, like I said, economics are going to come into that too. I would like to care about the world, but I'm making some good money, Not me, but actually I am. I'm very happy with the money I'm making as a school teacher. You'll hear me say it many times during the year, but I do have the best job in the world. For me, anyway. Okay, so here's a little bit of a graphic showing you the idea of what I've been talking about. And again, please remember that this video is in 2022. So these numbers are going to change right now. Actually, these numbers are a little bit older. I think these numbers come back to about 2011. So currently, these are correct in one sense. The numbers are growing, but the United States has about 350 million people currently here in 2022, and China still has the largest population for a country, but it's possible that during this school year of 2022-2023, India will overtake China. That's the projections. But here you can see with hunter and gatherers, the population stayed pretty constant. That was sustainable. But look how it's jumping up. You can't keep doing that exponential growth forever. So here's some of the projections of what it'll be like by 2100. How old will you be in 2100? What will the world's population be? Boy. Anyway, these are interesting thoughts, and it's kind of a good idea to understand what's going on. Here's an understanding for you, is the role of economics. Oh, I'm sorry, before I go on to that, there's one more thing that I wanted to say as far as numbers that will change. But this is a good number to be aware of. Right now, it's 7.5 billion people. That's about how many people we're talking about, edging up toward 8 billion. But, that's 2022. So maybe you watch this 5 years from now. It would be interesting to know what those numbers are. All right, economics. Gotta have the economics. We want our stuff. We want to be able to live this nice lifestyle, right? So what we do typically is we throw energy and materials into the system, and the system gives us goods, and on the other end we get a loss of valuable energy, the energy that was in a form that could be very useful to us. A lot of that energy is lost to heat, to the environment, and it was a one-way deal. Now, I've mentioned the idea of cycles already, and the nutrient cycling, and how there's no waste in nature. Nature doesn't waste. We're the one species that ever really figured out how to waste in a big way. So we're talking now, it used to be a straight line economics, straight line throughput, linear. And now there's movements going on to have a closed loop economy where we mimic nature a little bit more. So we take our energy and we take our resources and we build them in there where we're going to, some of the energy we have to lose, we know that, but we want to control the pollution and we want to reuse some of this stuff. So it's not linear, so it's more closed loop. So there's a lot of things that are going on with that. I guess there's things that you could use. Economic tools are things that we could be using as well, right? We could do the full cost pricing, as I said. And these extra costs that are not built into the product, they're external. And there's a phrase that's growing in usage now, and that's externalities. So the externalities are the extra costs that we don't pay for up front, but we pay for later. And speaking of not paying for things up front, there's subsidies. So the fossil fuel, let's take the petroleum industry where we get our gasoline, are subsidized by the government. So there's another thing with these subsidies, right? Right now, when we go to the gas pump, well, here in 2022, the prices are dipping a little. We're getting a little under $4.50, but we recently had a jump up. What's the price of gasoline now while you're listening to this? That's a fluctuating number, right? But the gas company is subsidized, so we're all shocked right now about the gas prices. But the gas companies are subsidized by our government, and that's very nice of our government to help out these gas companies. But they do it with the tax dollars, and those tax dollars come from us. I give about 30% of my hard-earned money to the government to do as they see fit, and this is part of what they see fit doing with it currently, is subsidizing it. These oil companies. So basically, I'm paying for more for my gas than I would believe when I go to the pump. But we could also, with these economic tools, subsidize renewables. There's movements with that as well. We're doing some of that, and these things go back and forth politically as well. Taxing is a way they could do it. Some people suggest that we should tax the people who are doing the polluting and not tax people's income as much, that we shouldn't rely on them, that we should make these companies pay for the pollution and the externalities that they're causing. But these are all things that are in flux and change with different political climates, so that's very interesting too. And the government can do things with their policies, and they can do things with their environmental agencies and agencies that are supposed to look out for us. Here's a great example is, when they started industrializing, the workers didn't really have all these many rights, right? But now we have OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, and they're supposed to make sure that people have safe working environments, right? So there's a lot of legislation in there where the government can help out. So they create these agencies that can really help out, I guess, some of these things. And environmental policies like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, started talking about how we're not going to pollute these things as much as we have been doing. So there you go. There's a lot of the things to think about. By the way, but think about this government business. If you're going to put in these policies that are really going to help as things get more dramatic, people are going to be hurting in lots of different ways. And one of the ways they're going to hurt is by the lifestyle will have to change a little bit. We can't go on the way we're going on, the way things currently are. But are you looking to get elected? Are you looking to get reelected? Do you want to tell people the hard truths and instigate these policies that are they might not reelect you? So that's a very interesting thing with the government and all this and how that works out. Okay, so we can do these things with laws. Some of the things that we do are, there's a wide range. And like I said, this is fluctuating as we get into different people in government. I've seen it over the course of teaching this class and certainly over the course of my lifetime. So this is the world we're living in, and I hope you get the idea already that this class is about the world. It's really about the world and our potential future in it, sustainability, right? So what are you going to do if you want an environmentally sustainable society? Like I said, you're going to have to come up with some new ways of generating energy is one thing. You're going to have to cut down on the degrading of the environment. But this is something that we're going to have to really look into doing. And I want to say something in closing for this video here, this first video of the year. I'm going to give you information. Please do not rely on me for all of the information. I'm going to give you some information, but you should be going after information along these lines constantly. Because it'll help you understand the world around you, even once this class is over. It's an important thing, I believe, anyway, to understand how the world works and what's going on with it. And please ask questions, not just of me, but of the material. When I bring up this information that I throw at you, I threw a bit at you here today, think about what questions does that raise? We can live more sustainably. Well, how can we live more sustainably? But don't be afraid if you don't know the answers to the questions right away. And I'm going to let you in on something. I won't either. It's a lot going on. But once we start asking the questions, it's a great first step. We'll get some of the answers. I can provide a bunch of them. You're going to provide some of them in your learning as well. And then that raises more questions. And then that sets us down a path that we don't even know where we're going, right? They didn't know what was happening when they created these unintended consequences, and we don't know what the future exactly is going to hold. But the more we understand where we're at and how we got here, perhaps we have a chance of creating a way to do it sustainably. Okay, well, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you back in class, and I look forward to a great year with you here, whatever year it is we're spending time together. All right. Thank you for your kind attention.